Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to make a bowl, a large salad bowl. So we're going to use roughly about maybe 4 or 5 pounds of clay. So I'm going to cut this big chunk of clay like this, and then this is probably, right here is probably about, this is probably about 12 pounds. So I'm going to cut this like this. And now I'm going to cut a little bit off the top of here, which will be about the size I want. Alright, I'm going to wrap this back up. And now what we're going to do is wedge the clay, because this is an important part of the process where we're getting out any air bubbles. So it's kind of like kneading dough. So we'll do this for a little while. There's a certain technique where you're rolling with this hand, rolling it around, and just pushing it down on itself to make sure that there's no air bubbles inside, because when you're throwing the clay, if there's any air bubbles, it sort of throws you off.
Why is that? What does it do, the air bubbles? Why?
The air bubbles, the reason you don't want the air bubbles is, number one, it makes it more difficult to get a nice clean throw. And number two, in the kiln, if there's air bubbles in the clay, what they'll do is they'll expand and then crack. The pot will actually crack in the kiln. So you want to make sure there's no air bubbles at all.
Yeah.
Nice little lump of clay. It's going to be our bowl. Okay, now on to the next step.
Great.
Okay, so now we have our about 4-pound hunk of clay, and now what we're going to do is what's called throwing the pot. So we're going to first take this and literally throw it on the wheel, but then wind up pulling it. So don't be scared, it's going to make a loud noise. Alright, so now we've got our pot on the wheel, we turn on the wheel, and now we're going to center it. This is really one of the most important parts of the process, because if the clay isn't centered on the wheel, nothing that follows is going to work correctly, because it's all got to be very centered for when you start pulling up on the sides. So when somebody's first learning pottery, the centering is really what takes probably the most amount of time. For some people it can take months to learn, some people never actually get it, and some people get it really quickly.
How was your experience with that?
I got centering, in a couple of sessions.
That's good. Congratulations.
Thank you. And you'll notice that what I'm doing is I'm putting a lot of water. It's actually not straight water, it's called slip on the outside to make the clay nice and slidey along my hands so it doesn't catch. Alright, so now this is pretty well centered. Now what I'm doing is I'm making decisions about what kind of bowl I want to throw. And I knew I wanted to do a salad bowl. I'm thinking, well, how wide out do I want that salad bowl? Do I want it to be something that is shaped like this, or more like this? How wide do I want the bottom on the inside? And I think I want this inside to be maybe about 5 inches wide. So the reason that's important right now is that I'm going down in the middle. It's going to be the center of the bowl. Going down with 2 fingers. Going down to what I think is going to be the right thickness for the bottom. More or less. I'm going to test that out in just a second. I'm going to come out. Before I come out too much, what I want to do is use my pin tool here and just see how thick that bottom is. Okay, that's a good thickness. It's a pretty nice thickness because you'll see in the next step where I trim, I'm going to be trimming some off the bottom, so I don't want it to be perfect thickness. I'd like it to be a little thicker than I ultimately will want. Now what I'm doing is I'm using my fingers and coming out from the inside.
Make it wider.
To make it wider and wider. Until I am about where I'm going to want the inside of that salad bowl. I'm going to keep adding water so it stays nice and slippery on the surface of the clay so that my fingers don't stick. The other thing I'm doing in here is I'm thinking about I want that inside of the bowl to be really beautiful, flat bottom on the inside, and then we're going to curve up slightly at the very bottom. So you can't start throwing yet. You have to really prepare this inside of the bowl. You might even test the base one more time to make sure it's the right thickness. Yep, good. Now I'm going to use this tool. This is a rib. I'm going to get it nice and wet. I'm going to get this inside of the bowl really nice and flat. Okay.
That's to smoothen it, I guess, right?
To smooth it out. Mm-hmm. I'm also compressing the bottom because that's what's going to help it not crack. Bowls are, it's easy to crack in the kiln. So you're pressing down, compressing. Okay, now it's about the width that I want. Now I'm going to get the outside nice and smooth and get ready to throw. By throwing now what I mean is pulling up. Okay.
I can see it.
Alright, so now it's about where it's going to be. I want to make it as perfect as I can, getting ready for my first throw. Alright, so I'm going to take the water, get it nice and slick on the inside and the outside. I'm going to do what's called my first throw, where I'm using this finger and this finger, pushing in here, pushing out there, and then pulling up, pulling the clay up. Alright, here we go. You'll see the clay getting taller and taller. It's just because I'm pushing in from the outside and out from the inside, getting as much height out of that clay as I can. And one of the things that I do along the way is I clean out the inside of the bowl. You notice I've been adding water along the way, but I want to clean it out so it doesn't get too slushy inside, because if you just leave that water in there, the clay ultimately is going to get slushy and almost disintegrate. So you need to keep that as dry as you can. We're going to keep adding water to the outside as we do our next throw, but clean it out in between throws. So now I'm getting the surface nice and moist again. Now I'm going to do my second throw, which is really, again, it's a pull. I'm going to be pulling up. And you can see now why it was so important to have the clay centered. Because if the clay wasn't centered, you wouldn't be able to do this. It would all be flop, flop, flop. Alright.
You also decrease the speed.
I'm keeping the speed kind of down. You could go a little bit faster than I'm going, but keeping the speed down a bit. Keep it up when I'm centering, but then down as I'm pulling. It just gives you more control. You want to have control when you're trying to throw something symmetrical. I'm going to do one more throw, just try to get a little bit more out of this clay. You'll see I'm also coming out wider at the top right now. So it's forming more of a bowl shape than a cylinder shape.
It's beautiful.
Make it nice and smooth, the lip. Now I'm going to look at it. Well, first I'm going to get some of that slush out from the inside. Naturally it's gotten wet because I keep adding water. I'm going to go again with this rib on the inside to make that bottom a little bit smoother. The clay at this point is so sensitive because it's really soft. So you just have to be careful not to hit it wrong. Okay, so that side is pretty good. Gonna get a little bit better. Okay, so you can see the inside, it's pretty good. Now I'm going to come up one more time, and at this point I'm going to pull out a little bit further to make it a wider bowl. Alright, so I'm making it nice and wet. Now you're going to see where it starts taking shape as the ultimate bowl it will be. Shaping it a little bit better. Again, pulling out a little bit more because I'd like it a little bit wider at the top. I'm also asking myself, do I want to have some of these throw lines on the outside, or would I like it to be nice and smooth? And I think for purposes of what I'm doing, I'd like it to be as smooth as possible on the outside. A lot of people prefer the throw lines. If they're using a glaze that breaks nicely on throw lines, they might want to keep those throw lines. But I'm going to be using pretty contemporary colors on the outside that I don't really want them to break along with throw lines. Nice and smooth. The reason that I'm careful with this part, with making sure the rim is smooth and actually what I want is flat, is because I know ultimately I'm going to be glazing that rim in a different color. I'm going to sit back and ask myself, is that what I like? Is that what I like? And you know what? It's pretty close. A little bit more shaping on the outside here. Now, one of the things that I like to do, this is just a stylistic thing, is I like to have a little swirl on the inside. So, drop my hands, and then on the very inside, I'm going to take this finger and make a swirl on the bottom. And this is kind of nice because, number one, it shows the hand of the potter in the bowl, but also the glaze will break really nicely the inside on that swirl. So you can see that it's a handmade piece. It's not something you just buy at a department store. Okay. Now, on the outside here, I'm going to trim away, this is a trimming tool, I'm going to trim away some of this clay. And in the next step, what we're going to be doing is a much more elegant trim. that outside nicer. We have to wait until the clay is leather hard being the stage between now and when it's actually dry to do the trimming. Okay, so now we have our wet bowl.
Wow.
Now on to the next step.
Wow, congratulations.
Okay, so this is the bowl that we just threw. Now what we do is we wait for that bowl to dry a bit, but not too much. It dries to the point where it's what's called leather hard. Now I made this bowl yesterday, and because of the weather conditions now, this is perfect because it's been pretty humid out here. If it was really dry, then really you wouldn't wait more than a few hours to get to this point. But you see where this doesn't move so much anymore. It's a nice firm bowl, but it's not dry. Now what we're going to do is called trimming. So I've taken that bowl, turned it upside down, I've centered it on this wheel. Now I'm going to take a few pieces of clay to hold it in place. And then we're going to start trimming. All right, so here we go. And what this is doing is we're creating the foot or the pedestal or whatever it is that you want ultimately this bowl to have as its base. We're trimming away all the excess clay and making it a bit lighter. We're going to start here in the middle. We're going to trim away just to the point where we say, okay, this is about as wide as we want that base. I think I'm just about there. And this is why we left some thickness on the bottom when we threw it, is because we knew we were going to be trimming at this point.
I like that spiral.
Yeah, the spiral is nice, and this is why a lot of times you'll see a potter, when a potter is looking at another potter's bowls, they turn them over, because potters know what to look for. And they look for, how was it trimmed? Alright, now my particular bowls, what I want is I want to have a nice tall pedestal on the outside. So this just depends on what you're looking for in the final bowl. I mean, if I was going for a little foot, I would probably stop right here. But I actually want a nice big pedestal because I'm going to do some carving in it. So I'm thinking to myself, a bowl this size. This is why I also left some extra weight in clay when I threw it, because I knew I was going to be trimming this off, because I want this to really look like a pedestal, almost a pedestal that was added at the end. A pedestal really gives the final bowl a certain formality. So what I'm doing here is probably far bigger than a normal foot would be for most potters. But this is what I'm going to wind up using when I do some carving into this bottom here. I got that. Now I'm going to trim away this. You don't really want to have too much down here to trim because you want to use as much clay as you could in getting the height on the bowl, as opposed to trimming it away now. Like for example, if I had 4 or 5 pounds of clay, I'd like to get as much height as I can get out of that 4 or 5 pounds. I don't want to trim it away because this stuff is just going to be wasted.
Really? So you cannot use those all this trimmed away clay anymore?
You could. Some potters do. Some potters recycle everything. I recycle the clay that that's nice and moist. Stuff that's drier like this is a much more involved process of getting it wet again, and then there's a certain machine that some potters have to do a lot of throwing. It's called a pug mill, where you put all the wet clay in it, and it gets all the air bubbles out, and it turns it into almost like a log of clay.
Oh, I see.
Okay, so I'm just going to touch it up a little bit. And again, this is just because I personally want to have a nice, big pedestal here. You'll see why in just a minute. wide, so I'm still going to come out just a little bit more on the inside. And I can touch that up as well. Now the next step is going to be the carving step. This is not something every potter would do, but it's something that I do in the bowls, and you'll see this in the final bowl, where the carving is kind of my own individual touch. And it's just something I've been doing for the past year or so. Once I feel like I've got a nice pedestal, I'm going to start my carving. Potters have all kinds of tools that they use for different parts of the process. This nice big tool is good for trimming, big chunks off. But now my next tool...
Looks like a bottle opener.
Yeah,
Funny,
doesn't it? My next tool is a much more fine tool. This is what I'm going to use to carve little lines in the clay, little horizontal lines in this pedestal. It's hard to talk during this process because it's almost like I feel like I'm a dentist. A dentist or a surgeon, somebody who's has to be really careful. Okay, and then the final what I'm going to do is make a nice little angle that will bring the pot a bit above the surface of the table when it's turned back over and give it a nice little shadow at the very bottom. And that is the step of carving.
Wow. So we're moving from here to here.
Okay, so now we have our bowl that's been trimmed, partially carved. Now what I did is I put this on top of one of these little turntables. I'm going to finish my carving by doing angled lines, just by going like this. And I'm going to continue this all the way around to give it that pattern, kind of almost a dancing pattern. just do your best to be consistent in terms of the angle and the distance, assuming you want to have a consistent pattern.
I remember you telling me last time that it has a very therapeutic aspect.
This part isn't so therapeutic because this is a little more stressful. The throwing part I find therapeutic. Design, this type of intricate design isn't my forte, but I still think it makes a big difference in the ultimate bowl, so I've been focusing on this more over the past few years. Because no matter what shape you make for the bowl, and no matter how well or not well you throw the bowl, the first thing that people see is the design. They see the color and the design. So you really have to do your best to make it pleasing. And I like having this pedestal that has its own carving, because a lot of potters focus on painting the bowl itself or making patterns in the bowl itself. You don't see a lot of potters who focus a lot on the pedestal, but I think the pedestal subtly gives it a really nice feel. It can either be formal, it can be whimsical, and I think going at these angled lines like this makes it a little more whimsical than formal. Because the pottery that I make, I really want it to be fun to use. I want it to accent the food well, be useful, but also make you happy when you're serving in it or eating from it. Okay, so now I've gone all the way around this bowl.
Beautiful.
I'm going to just touch it up a little bit. Then I am going to sign it. Turn it over. Voila!
Beautiful. Very, very pretty.
Thank you. Ready? Okay, so now we have our bowl that has been trimmed here with those horizontal lines, and then I made some vertical lines to give it this pattern. This at this point is very, very fragile. It's what's called bone dry, but it's really fragile. Just one wrong move and this will break into pieces. So now what we're going to do is fire this. So we take the bowl, bring it over to our kiln, and we're going to load it into the kiln.
The kiln is like an oven, right?
It's like an oven that gets to about 2,000 degrees.
Oh.
And that's this step. Okay, so now this kiln has been going for roughly about 6 hours. It's gotten up to about 2,000 degrees. We let it cool off for about a day. And now we open it, and what we see inside are the baked pieces. So they're this pink color, but now it's much stronger. Now it's actually not terribly fragile. Still don't want to drop it. But this is the point where we're going to take it over to our glazing area. A lot of potters make their own glazes. I tend to not make my own glazes. So I would use a prepared glaze in the colors that I want. What I'm going to do at this point is get it nice and prepared for the glazing by getting all the dust off. Then I'm going to glaze it by essentially painting on the glaze. Put it back in that kiln for another firing that's even hotter. That one will be about 2100 degrees. And when I take it out of the kiln the next time, what I'm going to have is a bowl that looks like this. So with a glaze on the inside, glaze on the outside, and then, this is the reason that I did that flat rim, is that I like this white glaze, which is different from this glaze, to make it stand out. That is how I make a bowl.